I'm Tracy, and I'm from the Merrimac Public Library, and I'm going to be reading for the last installment of Friday Night Frights, presented by the Teen Advisory Group. So I hope you enjoy The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. The night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of the Whites family cottage, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess as the white-haired old lady knitted quietly by the fire. "Listen to that wind. I should hardly think he'd come tonight," said Mr. White as he studied the board. "Ah, there he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and, opening the door, greeted their guest. Mrs. White smiled gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man with beady eyes and a ruddy face. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The major shook hands and, taking the seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. After the third glass of whiskey, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The family listened with eager interest to the visitor from distant parts as he spoke of wild scenes, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. "I'd like to go to India myself," continued the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and mystics and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day, about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw, dried and shriveled up." He took something out of his pocket and held it up. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is so special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it himself, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old holy man," said the sergeant major. "He wanted to prove that fate rules people's lives, and that those who interfere with it did so to their sorrow. The spell allows 3 men to each have 3 wishes granted." His manner was so ominous that they were aware that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you ask for 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier looked at him in the way that middle age would regard a precocious child. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his teeth as he downed the last of his drink. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." A heaviness filled the room, and a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now, then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "I fancied it, I suppose," he said slowly. "I was going to sell it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough trouble already." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," he said, contemplating. The soldier took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the old man, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend sharply. "I threw it on the fire, and if you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man." The old man shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for more help for me?" Her husband drew the paw from the pocket, and then all three burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, grabbed him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. During supper, the paw was partly forgotten, and afterward the family sat listening intently to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is like the other far-fetched stories he told us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, "we shouldn't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, Father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A little," said Mr. White, "and he didn't want it, but I made him take it. Then he warned me to throw it away again." "Likely," said Herbert with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Your first wish should be to become an emperor, Father." Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, that's a fact," he said slowly. "Seems to me I've got all I want." "If you could pay off the house debt, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his father's shoulder. "Well, wish for £200, then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling, embarrassed at his own gullibility, held up the paw, as his son sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. Suddenly, a crash from the piano followed his words, interpreted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the paw as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been the way you said it," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done. But it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the father and son finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was howling, and the old man startled at the sound of a door banging upstairs. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting up on top of your dresser, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." In the brightness of the wintry morning sun at the breakfast table, Mr. White quietly laughed at his fears. There was an air of calmness about the room which had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard, with a carelessness which signaled no great belief in its power. "The idea of us listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 possibly hurt you, dear?" said Mrs. White. "Might drop on his head from the sky," said Herbert with a chuckle. "Morris said the wishes happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might think it was a coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come home," said Herbert as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed and followed him to the door, watched her son disappear down the road, and returned to the breakfast table. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did. There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in at the house nervously, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. Remembering the wish the night before, she made notice that the stranger was very well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with a sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron and went to the door. She brought the stranger, who seemed on edge, into the room. He was clearly preoccupied, as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's tattered coat. She then waited as patiently as she could for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked up a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady startled. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interrupted. There, Mother, he said hastily. Sit down now and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And he eyed the man hopefully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he's not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as she realized the real meaning of his assurance, that her son was no longer in pain. And seeing the awful confirmation of her fears in the visitor's averted face, she caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at a length in low voice. Caught in the machinery, repeated Mr. White. Yes. He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, he held it tightly. He was the only child we had left, he said, turning gently to the visitor. The old man rose and walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking round. I beg that you will understand I am only their messenger and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant may have carried into his first battle. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they do wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the word. How much? 200 pounds was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. In the cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their son and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly believe it. It was too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed. The grief pulled them further apart. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of quiet weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. Come back, he said tenderly. You will be cold. It is colder for my son, said the old woman. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. The paw, she cried wildly. The monkey's paw. He startled in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter? She came stumbling across the room toward him. I want it, she said quietly. You've not destroyed it. It's in the parlor on the mantel, he replied. Why? She cried and laughed together and, bending over, kissed his cheek. I only just thought of it, she said hysterically. Why didn't you think of it before? Why didn't you think of it? Think of what? He asked. The other 2 wishes, she replied rapidly. We've only had one. Was that not enough? He demanded fiercely. No, she cried triumphantly. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again. The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his shaking limbs. Good God, you are mad, he cried. Get it, she panted. Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy. Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. Get back to bed, he said unsteadily. You don't know what you're saying. We had the first wish granted, said the old woman feverishly. Why not the second? A coincidence, stammered the old man. Go and get it and wish, cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He has been dead 10 days, And besides, I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how will you look at him now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think that I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down into the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The monkey paw was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring back his mutilated son before he could escape from the room took control of him. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with it in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she commanded. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The monkey paw fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. The old man sank trembling into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the wish, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and laid beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the tick of the clock. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time building up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at that same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely heard, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled on the floor. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, sitting up. A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband jumped in front of her and grabbed her by the arm, holding her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy, it's Herbert!" she cried, struggling to free herself. "He must have walked from the cemetery. Why are you holding me? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sakes, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock and another. The old woman suddenly broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her desperately as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his knees and hands, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. The repeated knocking echoed through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door open. A cold wind rushed up the stairs, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. I hope you've enjoyed The Monkey's Paw.